What does the Stalker acronym mean? I've been asking that question while replaying the original trilogy in the lead up to Stalker 2. I thought the answer was going to be relatively boring. Maybe there would be some lore implications, but after completing Shadow of Chernobyl and Clear Sky in the past few months, I wasn't any closer to understanding what it meant. I've been a huge fan of the franchise since its release, but had never really thought about its meaning. I was immersed in the world and had a great time, but didn't even know there were multiple endings, let alone a true and canon ending to the first game when it released. Now I'm back in the zone, I need to know, what is this mark's meaning? So let's start there in our search for the answer, where it starts in Shadow of Chernobyl. Spoilers, if for some reason you're worried about spoilers for a game that is over a decade old. In Shadow of Chernobyl, the main character S.T.A.L.K.E.R has no memory of his life prior to the game beginning. He wakes up with the stalker mark on his arm, which leads to him being given the nickname Marked One. It's commented, he has the mark, leading to the belief this must have some significance, as the traitor Sidorovich exclaims,
"Bullshit! You're lying!"
Let the zone take me if I am.
When he hears the man is alive and has the mark. But the mark isn't referenced in any great detail again until the game's finale, and that's assuming you succeed in the true ending. And this is where I need to make a key distinction. The mark Stalker and the term Stalker, when referring to inhabitants of the zone, are not the same. But let's focus on the mark for now. During the canon ending, you speak with a being known as C Consciousness. They tell you that the mark is being placed on stalkers who have been programmed or basically mind controlled by the being to carry out a task, and S.T.A.L.K.E.'s task had been to kill himself, which was an error in their process of controlling people. But we get no understanding of what the acronym means past this.
Stalker is a coded acronym which we use to mark agents programmed for particular missions. Your mission as our agent was to kill S.T.A.L.K.E.R and his group. They got too close to finding out things they shouldn't know. We created a network of psi fields on the way to the zone center in order to recruit agents. You know one of these fields by the name of Brain Scorcher. When a stalker attempts to reach the zone center in order to fulfill some wish, we acquire control over his consciousness and program him to a specific mission. A mistake was made, and your mission was to kill yourself.
There's no explanation of its meaning. Why would C Consciousness mark stalkers with such a specific brand, an acronymed version of the term they use to reference one another? It is placed onto those mind controlled by this being to help identify them as programmed agents, but surely any mark would have done. Why this? Something so obvious. So that's our first step. We've learned something. The mark is placed on stalkers by C Consciousness, but that raises the question, why do stalkers refer to themselves by that term? Is it related to these marks, or does it predate them? And this is where we fall into the rabbit hole. So let's try to understand why stalkers refer to themselves as such. Maybe we'll find some answers to the acronym. Within the game, those who are inhabiting the zone call themselves stalkers. They're people who have come to the zone to try and find artifacts to make a living, or in the hope of finding the wish granter among other things. But I've been unable to find any specific in-game explanation for the title they give themselves. So where did this come from? On release, the game's publisher THQ included in some marketing that the acronym stood for Scavengers, Trespassers, Adventurers, Loners, Killers, Explorers, and Robbers. Sounds like a passable answer. It does capture the main purpose of the game. It captures the motivations, the varying groups inhabiting the zone. Many want to explore, many want to scavenge and make money off the artifacts they find. Many kill, and many are referred to as loners when not part of a faction. Is it that simple? Is the answer just a small marketing jab? But how does this make any sense in the game's universe? And would all stalkers identify themselves by all of these terms? Killers, for example? Is this how the developers intended it? Is it just a catch-all for the zone's inhabitants? To answer that, we need to look at the developers' GSC and what inspired them, and this is where we start to unravel this thread. The Stalker series was inspired in part by a film and a book that came prior. The book, in turn, inspiring the film itself. Inspiration on top of inspiration. First, the book, Roadside Picnic, by Russian authors Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, released in 1972. The book is centered around a world that has been visited by aliens. The visits, while only lasting a couple of days in remote areas, left behind artifacts and anomalies. This is framed in the sense aliens may have left what they considered ordinary or junk-like material, but to humans, these held special properties. The contact left zones in the world in which unusual artifacts could be found, and as you'd expect of mysterious and valuable artifacts, people began to enter these zones which were guarded by the military, and began taking artifacts to sell. Sounding a little bit familiar? These individuals called themselves stalkers, and this book actually contributed to the term stalker acquiring a new common tongue meaning, or definition of guide in Russia, especially for those who venture into forbidden or uncharted territories, like those who take tourists to visit the Chernobyl exclusion zone, or ghost towns nearby to the disaster. This is actually quite an interesting take. It would explain why the term was used for the game's inhabitants. The designers, while Ukrainian, likely has some of this influence given their geolocation, and to call the game's inhabitants stalkers makes a great deal of sense within this context. And the movie, aptly named Stalker, released in 1979, whose screenplay was created by the writers of Roadside Picnic and inspired by the character Stalky by Rudyard Kipling. It's a tale of a man who guides a writer and professor into an exclusion zone that is said to disobey the laws of physics and contain remnants of seemingly alien activity. He guides them there to find a place called The Room, which was said to grant wishes to those who enter. Is this also sounding familiar? This movie makes mention of anomalies, with one in particular standing in the way of the group preventing entry, which would kill any who stepped into it. This movie and this book as inspiration likely coined the term stalker for the developers, as the characters entering these zones in both cases were called stalkers, as it became a more common term for guide. The movie director himself kept a diary in which he wrote stalker is from the word to stalk, to creep. In the book, in the movie, and the games, the characters are all creeping into various exclusion zones, and while each story has distinct differences, it's clear where the game drew their inspiration. After all, alien-like artifacts, a wish granter. While the game's story departs heavily from the book and movie, there is a consistent theme of human consciousness and human desire within each. So we have a fairly solid idea of where the term stalker came in. But what about the acronym? Let's finish this by returning to focus on the developers GSC. We know why these characters call themselves stalkers. They're evading, guiding, and creeping into areas they shouldn't be in. But the acronym isn't used in the movie nor the book. So what does it mean? Why would C Consciousness use this specific mark on those they program? This is where I'm diving into community information, so it gets a bit spotty. The original game was released way back in 2007. I've been struggling to find anything specific from the developers touching on this, given the amount of time that's passed, and it has been challenging to try and find any direct comments, of which there are few to none. Some community posts suggested that the developers ran into trouble with the trademarks, and included the periods between letters to avoid this problem, turning the name into an acronym to be able to use the term, but without having an immediate attached meaning to it. Another community post by Redditor Ragesh highlights that in a specific build of the game from March of 2006, a year before release, some Ukrainian in-game dialogue provided an explanation, but this never made it to the final version and didn't appear at all in the English files. Now, I'll link to this post in the description so you can check it out, but this is also part of it here on screen. This dialogue that didn't make it into release detailed that Stalker was an acronym for... I can't pronounce any of that. But the Redditor attempted to translate it, and came to the conclusion that in English, it likely translates to Stationary Tactical Personality Annihilator of Professor Kamenov's Capacitive Discharge. Now, you eagle-eyed viewers might realize that doesn't spell Stalker, and that's because it's been translated. Again, I won't even try, but in the developer's language, this likely made sense with the word being spelt differently, but doesn't when translated for an English-speaking audience. Again, why it's likely this didn't appear in the English files, because it wouldn't make any sense. This acronym was supposed to reference the Wish Granter, as some additional cut dialogue reveals, which is a large monolith you find at the end of the game, and interacting with it leads to your character's demise and a false ending. In this prior version, it looks like the Wish Granter was perhaps meant to brainwash rather than kill. As the Redditor points out, this isn't canon, however. It isn't the final release, so while this is really interesting theory, and is likely the original plan for the acronym, it didn't make it to the final build, which isn't uncommon for games. We hear about cut content all the time. So where does that leave us? Sadly, without much of a satisfying answer. All I could dig up was the THQ answer for the acronym, which is as close as we get to canon, but it sadly doesn't fit the world too well, or the story, and probably sounded good around a boardroom table, but doesn't really work in universe. We know the origin of why these people are called stalkers, but why C Consciousness chose to turn this into an acronym and imprint it on stalkers is unclear, and likely never had a solid story foundation, which is a shame. The mark is also discussed sparingly in the game, but the introduction cutscene makes it sound more interesting, pointing out that the character had a mark and was interesting to the merchant, and one being alive was almost unheard of. But then we see little more, and the mark is unceremoniously identified by C Consciousness as their brand for controlled agents, and nothing more. Ultimately, I am slightly disappointed there is no deeper meaning, but if there is any solace, Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl released in September. While C Consciousness is dead in the canon of the game, that doesn't necessarily mean we can't locate this information somewhere or have it known by a select few in the world. I would love to see GSC give this acronym and this intriguing mark some meaning in their upcoming title, even if it's a small Easter egg hidden away. What do you think of the Stalker lore? I love this game, this world, this idea. Maybe that's why I'm so interested in there being a deeper meaning behind it all. But it turns out the acronym was likely just a trademark issue and brought in very close to the end of development. But hey, if you know anything else, let me know in the comments. Thank you for checking out this video. A bit of a different take for me, but I had a great time looking into the backstory of this and its inspirations. If you enjoyed the video, throw me a like, sub if you want more, and I'll catch you in the next one. See you down in the comments. Cheers.